So Immanuel Kant is born in 1724 to dies in 1804, and he is alive during the Enlightenment Era. As we were just talking as a class, the reason why the fact that he's an Enlightenment Era philosopher is important is because it helps us to understand a little bit about the academic context into which he's coming in. So when we think about the Enlightenment, we think about a transition away from religious revealed truth to the idea that truth is now something that we can discover independently, that it can be verified through experiment, but most importantly, that experiments give us consistent results, right? That when I run the experiment, I get a certain result, and when you come along and run the experiment, you get the exact same result. Okay, so let's start by having a brief introduction in terms of Immanuel Kant, the person. First, we have a quick discussion over his early life. Of the philosophers that we've studied this semester so far, he is the one who I think comes from the most impoverished background, in the sense that his family pretty much was very humble in terms of their origins. He was effectively a scholarship student. So what happened is that his mother was very devout and very involved in her local church. And when her children, it came time for them to go to school, she was basically able for them to get an elementary school education, even though her family, strictly speaking, wouldn't have been able to afford it. And then the young Immanuel, when he got to school, it became clear that he was exceptional. And so the decision was made to figure out a way to have him continue going to school, okay? So he goes to university, he comes back to Königsberg, and he becomes a professor there, okay? In terms of his lifestyle, he was a bachelor for his entire life. I don't want you to think that he was a complete shut-in. He was often invited to dinner parties around town, and everybody thought that he was an interesting and engaging dinner party guest. But he was very well known for having strict habits. Specifically, he would go out on a walk at what we believe to be the same time of day every day. I say this, we believe, because the clocks of Königsberg began to be set by when Dr. Herr Kant went on his walk. So if he was ever late, he wouldn't be, because the clock was set to when he was going out. And the Philosopher's Walk still exists in Königsberg, at the time Prussia, in present-day Germany, I believe. So if you are ever in Königsberg and want to walk the same path that Kant walked every day to see whether your thoughts are any different, the walk is still there awaiting you. Now, one of the other things that's kind of unusual about Kant is that we normally think of philosophers as, if they're going to make a huge impact, that they do so very early in life. And that's not the case with Kant. By the time that he was in his early 40s, he had written some things, but they were not seen as being particularly earth-shattering. Okay, so basically, he is a backwater professor writing inconsequential things until he reads the philosophy of David Hume. And Kant describes the experience of reading Hume in one of the most beautiful ways, I think, in the history of Western philosophy. He says that it woke him out of his dogmatic slumber, and that Hume really made him rethink everything that he had been thinking. So he basically goes from being an inconsequential philosophy professor to, you can't take an ethics class in the Western world without talking about Immanuel Kant through the influence of having read Hume. Okay, well, that obviously raises the question, what's so important about Hume's philosophy that it had such an impact on Kant? And the long answer to this is to say, come and take Intro to Philosophy from me, or to go and take Modern Philosophy for Professor Blum, because we will spend a great deal of time talking about Hume in those classes. But the shorter answer is that Hume really begins to question and be skeptical about this notion of causation. He ultimately argues that causation is something that we impose on our experience, but that it is not something that is inherent within the experience itself. What does causation sound like? What does it taste like? What does it smell like? That's not really a question that makes any sense. So Hume ultimately is going to argue that there are principles of association that we impose on our experiences in order to make sense of them, but that they're not a part of the experience. So Kant really begins to be very skeptical on the basis of having read Hume. Okay? Now, let's go back to talking about the fact that Kant is an Enlightenment era philosopher for a moment. So, as we mentioned, the Enlightenment means that there is a focus on the sciences. And what we like about the sciences is that they appear to grant us some measure of certainty, right? You run the experiment, you get the same results when I run it as you get when you run it, okay? That there's a certain consistency, if you will. So the laws of physics are such that it doesn't matter whether I'm the one who's applying them or you're the one who's applying them, right? If we have an object, say this thing, and we hold it up, and then we drop it, we can determine, okay, well, how much force did the object expend on the table when it was dropped? And in terms of physics, we can establish that by saying, well, how much did the object have in mass? What is the force of gravity? And what is the height from which we dropped it, right? And we can make a force diagram chart and run the numbers and figure out exactly what the force was that the object hit the table. And it doesn't matter whether it's you or me or him who does the calculations are going to be the same. So Kant starts thinking, wouldn't it be nice if we could bring that same level of certainty to morality? If it would be possible to have principles that we apply to everyday situations that tell us how to behave in those situations in the same way that the laws of physics tell us exactly how much force the remote control expended on the table when it hit the table. Okay, so that's the plan. That's the desired goal. Now, how are we going to get there? Real quick, I want to spend just a few minutes talking to you very briefly about Kant's ontology or metaphysics. And I'm basically going to give you about enough Kant on this particular point to be dangerous, but not enough for you to really understand what's going on. And once again, if you are interested in studying this more in depth, I would definitely urge you to take modern philosophy or Intro to Philosophy from Stefania Malacrida. She spent a lot more time reading Kant than I have. She's actually read the entirety of the Critique of Pure Reason in German, right? So that seems like a good professor to take intro from if you're interested in doing some more Kant. But I'm going to try to do my best in giving you a very small introduction to Kant's ontology. So Kant is going to draw a distinction between the noumenal world and the phenomenal world. And the phenomenal world is not phenomenal in the sense of being, ooh, awesome, right? As sometimes we use the word phenomenal in everyday parlance. What we mean here is the world of phenomena. That is to say, the world of that which can be experienced. But Kant argues that there must perhaps also be what he calls a noumenal world. And the noumenal world is a world to which we do not have experiential access to. In the noumenal world is the answer to the questions, do I have a soul? In other words, does soul exist? Does God exist? Does free will exist? And then this thing which is called the thing in itself, or that in German we call Dasein. And the idea, D-A-S-E-I-N. And the idea here is that in order for me to have an experience, there must be something that I am experiencing. Maybe not, right? I could be in the Matrix, and maybe I'm just having an experience. I could be hallucinating. But for the most part, when I hold up my coffee cup and I drink from it, I can talk about my experience of the cup, but there is also a cup in it of itself, which makes it possible for me to have an experience of it. And I'm never going to be able to get access to the cup in it of itself. I can only get access to my experience of the cup. So my experience of the cup belongs to which of these? The phenomenal world. But Dasein, the cup in it of itself, belongs to the noumenal world. And I have some access to it in the sense that I can reason about it, but I don't have direct experiential access to it. Okay. So getting back to this question of certainty, let's talk about the difference between deontology and consequentialism. Now remember, for Kant, the desire is to have moral theorizing that gives us the same level of certainty as science. And what we have in Kant's theory and the next theory that we're going to study is basically the two theories that have, for the most part, most strongly shaped ethics since they've been written. In other words, you can't get out of taking an ethics class without talking about deontology. You can't take an ethics class without talking about consequentialism. I mean, I don't know. Maybe somebody teaches one that doesn't talk about these two theories, but I would be surprised. Okay? So let's make sure that we understand what these two terms mean. First, we have consequentialism. What word that you recognize do you see within consequentialism? Consequences. So what do you think consequentialism is about?
Like your actions having no consequences.
Having no consequences?
No, having an action.
Okay, so your actions have consequences, and if you want to act morally, what sorts of consequences are you looking for? Good ones, okay? So, and we'll talk about this in more detail later, but we can define consequentialism as the class of theories that defines a good action as the one that leads to the best results, that optimizes the consequences of the action. Now, what might be the problem with that from Kant's perspective of a desire to have certainty in moral theorizing?
Because he wants to have like a set way for everybody to follow, and if everybody has different perceptions of what is, I don't know, maybe their best consequence, then actions aren't going to always be straight across the board for everybody.
Okay, so some people might think that a consequence is good, while another person thinks that that same consequence is bad. And so there might be disagreement regarding whether a consequence is good or bad. Good. But that level of doubt is not quite as much doubt as I need us to have. Kant would say, how can you even be sure what the consequences of your actions are? You think you know what's going to happen when you do something. But can you be certain? No. So maybe I bring treats to class thinking, oh, this is a time of day where everybody's hungry, and it would be nice if I bring treats. And then it turns out that someone here has a nut allergy and I brought something that had nuts but it wasn't labeled. And that student dies. Right? Just to go to an extreme example. Well, okay, wouldn't it have been better in that situation if I hadn't brought treats?
You're talking to a hungry student, so.
Or you can just ask before.
Okay, fine. It's not a nut allergy. Somebody chokes on the donut and dies. Okay? If you're still saying, I wish she had brought treats, even if one of the classmates died, remember that classmate could be you. Right? So, the idea is, and then somebody might come back and say, well, but you know what? That person was really evil. And they were just taking ethics in order to justify their bad behavior. And if they hadn't died, they would have been worse than the next Hitler. The point is that you just can't know what the consequences of your action are. And Kant wants certainty in his ethical theorizing. He wants a rule that we can all apply that will tell us exactly what to do in any given situation. Now remember, Aristotle didn't think it was possible to establish such a rule. That's why he said we needed habits. But Kant thinks that not only is it possible, that he has found it. So before we get to that though, not trying to rush ahead, we do have this other word up here, deontology. And deontology is perhaps best defined as the theory that a good action is one that is performed out of duty. Figure out what you're supposed to do and then do it. Regardless of the consequences, because you can't know what the consequences are going to be anyway. But you can establish what duty requires of you. So just to make sure that we're all clearly on the same page, the reason why Kant thinks that deontology, understanding ethical theorizing in terms of duty, is preferable to consequentialism, the idea that we should maximize the effects of our actions, is because deontology gives us certainty in our ethical theorizing, whereas consequentialism can never give us any sort of certainty. Okay, so how are we going to get this certainty? Where's it going to come from? What rule is it that we're going to apply to our actions in order to be able to engage in doing the right thing? Before we get there, I want to talk for a second about free will. Now, does Kant think that we can know whether we have free will?
Yes, that's part of the
Where was free will on that previous slide? Noumenal, right? Whether we have free will belongs to the noumenal world, and do we have access to the noumenal world? No, it's like a locked vault. So Kant can't say, I have free will, right? Because it could turn out that there's an alien in outer space, right, who has a joystick that is choosing my every move, right? Very flamboyant alien out there that is choosing my every move, it would appear. So we can't say for sure that I have free will. So Kant is going to take a slightly more measured response. He's going to say, well, I believe myself to have free will, but I acknowledge that there may be instances in which I do not act freely. So for example, when I go to the doctor's office and they put me up there and they take out the little hammer and they hit my knee, do I have a choice as to whether I kick? No, it's a reflex response, right? Assuming that I'm not paralyzed or suffering from some other neurological disorder, I'm going to kick when that thing hits me. And it doesn't matter how much I brace myself or what buttons the alien pushes in their little joystick machine, right? That's a reflex. So what Kant is basically going to say is, look, our bodies are more likely to be determined. In other words, that they're going to do what they're going to do. And part of the reason for that is that they're corporeal, right? They're physical things. And physical things have to obey what? The laws of physics, science, right? I keep saying, how cool would it be if I just started levitating in the middle of this lecture, right? You wouldn't be paying attention to something else if I were just floating up here, right? You'd be wrapped eyeballs if I just started floating in the middle of lecture. Why can't I float in the middle of lecture? Well, because I'm beholden to the law of gravity, right? Or at least my body is. But maybe it's possible that my mind might be able to act freely. Might, right? Because it could turn out that I have no free will at all. So Kant is going to say, look, if you want to behave in accordance with the free will that you believe yourself to have, you can't just go out and act willy-nilly, reacting to whatever happens to you. Because in that situation, you're not acting freely. You are going to need to pick a maxim and apply it to the situation, and then act. And then maybe you can act in accordance with the free will that you believe yourself to have. The only maxim we could employ to make such a decision, according to Kant, is the categorical imperative. Our new friend. Okay, what do those words mean? Let's start with imperative. What does that mean? What's an imperative? A thing that you must do, right? It shares the same root word as emperor. An imperative is a command. So for all of you grammar buffs, sit up straight. No, none of you did it. Now you do, right? Now you stop slouching. That's a command, right? It doesn't make sense to talk about the truth value of it, but we can talk about whether you complied with it, right? So it's not an interrogative. It's not a question. It's not a declarative sentence. It's not declaring anything. It's an imperative. It's a command, okay? So an imperative is a thing you gotta do. All right. What about categorical? That's kind of a weird word. In this particular case, what categorical means is universal. So a categorical imperative is a universal command. It is a thing that you must do all the time, always. It's a command that must always be obeyed. And part of it is that it must always be obeyed on Kant's view because it is tied to this idea that I am a rational creature who believes herself to have free will. So in order for me to act in accordance with the free will that I believe myself to have, this is what I need to do. And honestly, in terms of what we're going to be doing with Kant in this class, we're primarily going to be concerned with understanding the categorical imperative so that we can apply it to some specific situations. So let's talk about this categorical imperative. First of all, there is one categorical imperative. One categorical imperative. But there are multiple ways of talking about it. There are multiple formulations of it. Just like in physics, you might have multiple formula that describe the same phenomena, right? And depending on the situation, you might use one formula because those are the variables that you have, and that's what makes your problem easier. Or in a different situation, you might use a different formula, but it's still the same physical principle that it's expressing, right? So multiple ways of talking about it, but one principle. Now, some authors argue that there were two formulations of the categorical imperative. Some authors go as high as 5. For our purposes, we're going to go with 3. The first formulation is universalizability. Act always such that you could will the maxim you act under to become universal law. Act always such that you could will the maxim you act under to become universal law. What's a maxim? The men's magazine? It's a rule. Fancy word for rule. That's easy enough. So what Kant is saying is, look, when you are trying to make a decision, let's break this down into 3 steps. The first thing that you need to do is to state the rule that you would be acting under. So let's say that I'm out shopping with a friend and she asks me that dreaded question, does this look good on me? And although she's very happy with the outfit and thinks that it's very flattering, it just doesn't look right on her. Right? What am I supposed to do? Well, I might be tempted to tell her, oh yeah, it looks great. If I were to do that, what rule would I be acting under? So, lying, it is permissible for me to lie to my friend in order to spare her feelings. Or maybe it's my own feelings that I'm sparing in that situation. But getting back to Kant. It is permissible for me to lie to my friend in order to spare feelings.
No.
Okay. Now, what would happen if we universalize that principle? If everybody lied all the time in every situation, what would the world look like in a world where everybody is constantly lying? How do we get to Houston? Go south on 35? Great. Right? I'll send you a postcard from Laredo. The point here is that that is not a world that would be rational. Now notice that Kant is not concerned with the consequences of the action. It may be the case that would we be happier in a world where everybody's lying all the time. But the point of universalizing the maxim is in order to establish whether the maxim itself is rational. This is just a test to establish that. Okay. So if there's one celebrity that you know that I love to make fun of, it's Kim Kardashian. Okay. So some of you may know that Kim Kardashian at one point was married to Chris Humphries, right? There was a very lavish wedding episode, which of course I did not see, but I hear that it raked in millions of dollars for the Kardashian empire, right? I don't know how much the wedding itself cost, but then the wedding episode brought in even more money. Now, Mr. Humphries declares that Miss Kardashian never intended to be married to him, that she only went through the wedding in order to make the money from the wedding episode, right? And he was suing her on the basis of this information. Okay, so imagine for a second that Ms. Kardashian and Mr. Humphries are standing at the altar, right? And they're about to get married. And the ghost of Immanuel Kant shows up right before Ms. Kardashian is about to say, I do, and pauses time. What might she ask KK? All right, you are about to state that you intend to be with this man forever. But you also intend not to remain with him. What is a promise? A promise is a current declaration of future action. Can I both declare that I'm going to remain with a man for the rest of my life and know that I do not intend to remain with him at the same time? Is that a logically consistent principle? No, because it's contradictory, right? Kim Kardashian would be both willing to remain with Chris Humphries and not willing to remain with him simultaneously. So is the principle of making a false promise the type of maxim that we can universalize? No, it's not rational on Kant's view. We couldn't all hold to both promise to do something and not do it at the same time. Doesn't work. So it is not the sort of principle that can be universalized. And hence it violates the categorical imperative. So we can't lie because that's not universalizable. We can't make false promises because that's not universalizable. And notice that this is not dependent on the situation. We can't lie no matter what is going on. So in the situation where the Gestapo come and knock on my door and they ask me, are you hiding Anne Frank in your attic? I have to give a truthful answer, or at least a non-lying one. But I cannot tell a falsehood, because if I do, I would be acting under the principle, the maxim, the rule, it is permissible to lie in order to save somebody's life. But if everybody were lying all the time, then that world would not be rational. Besides, we don't know what the consequences of the action are. Maybe the Gestapo already knows that Anne Frank is in my attic, and telling them the truth at least saves my life. Maybe the Gestapo member is so overwhelmed with the fact that I tell him the truth that he walks away. You know, and Kant has this whole murderer at the door scenario that he talks about, where there's a situation where somebody knocks on your door and basically says, can I hide in your house? There's a murderer coming after me. And then the murderer comes immediately after. And Kant is asking the question, should you answer the murder truthfully? And what he talks about is that maybe the person, after hiding in your house, left through the back door. And if you lie to the murderer and say, no, he's not here, then the murderer leaves and finds him in the back, and now you're culpable, right? Because if the murderer had come in, he wouldn't have found the guy. So remember, the whole point here is, can I know what the consequences of my actions are? No. But can I know what duty requires of me, understood through the concept of rationality? Yes. So I need to do what duty requires, which is to act in accordance with a principle that is capable of being universalized. A maxim I could will to become universal law. Questions or comments? You guys have been kind of quiet.
My brain shows the after spending 2 midterms, so it's kind of like cutting it out.
So your brain is still on vacation?
It was never on vacation. That's the side point.
Oh.
Yeah, I thought too.
What if the first person was actually the murderer? So, from Kant's point of view, would you just never trust anyone? Because you don't know the consequences?
What is trust?
Willingness to believe something.
Faith?
I mean, it might be faith. We might say that maybe it's an emotion, right? I feel like I can trust you. But is trust always rational?
No.
No. So is Kant really going to be focused on trust in terms of understanding what we should be doing? I mean, he was probably himself a trustworthy person, right? I mean, according to his theory anyway, he probably never lied.
I mean, would one approach be that he is applying these type of rules for behavior when you come across something? Would it be how would you let somebody in your house? If you let one guy escape from murder in your house, the next person, and like basically he's trying to say.
Well, look, it's not that he doesn't let the people in, right? He lets them in. It's just that when the murderer then comes at the door, he doesn't lie to them. Because he thinks that no matter what is going on, I have a perfect duty not to lie. And if you say, but if you tell the truth in this particular situation, somebody's going to die, Kant is going to say, I don't know. I don't know what the consequences of the action are.
To let someone in, that goes along with the same thing, that would be your duty to help somebody who's in need? Or like, would he say like you have to let them in because...
So we'll get back to this when we talk about imperfect versus perfect duties. But you could definitely argue that there is an imperfect duty to allow somebody to come in who you know is being chased by a murderer. But you also have a perfect duty not to lie. And Kant is going to say that your duties can never contradict.
So it's a universal law to always tell the truth.
Yes, it's a universal law to always tell the truth. I mean, and that's not the only thing that shakes out of the categorical imperative. I also can't kill anybody. Right? So if I say something like, I'm going to kill you because you asked an annoying question, it wasn't an annoying question, but like, let's just say for the sake of argument that that was the principle, we're the principle. Okay, well, if everybody killed everyone all the time for asking questions, what would happen? There would be no one left. And Kant thinks that humans are uniquely rational. So if there's nobody left because everybody's dead, there's no rationality. Right? So that can't possibly be a universalizable principle.
So this thing's all about rules and not what you think is like morally right or wrong, right? Like with the case with the
You have to apply rational.
Yeah. You'd like if you took him in, you'd morally say like, hey, come in and hide out. But like you said, you don't know if they're going to kill him or not. But morally speaking, everyone would let someone in that's getting chased by a murderer, and you'd probably lie saying that they weren't hiding out there.
Right, and just because everybody jumps off a bridge, does that mean that you're going to? I'm sure your mom told you that one, right? My mom did.
Hence, don't have a parachute.
Nice. See, you're more awake than you think you are. But
So it's nonsense.
Kant's point is that, look, if you're going to act freely, you need to act in accordance to a principle. Because if you're just reacting, then you're probably not acting freely. It may turn out that even when I try to act in accordance with a principle, I'm still not acting freely, but I have a better chance, if you will, of acting in accordance with the free will that I believe myself to have if I take this rule and I apply it. So one of the things that I find really paradoxical about this is that before reading Kant, I had this idea of, okay, if I'm acting freely and you're acting freely and we're both in the same situation, I'm going to do what I think is best, you're going to do what you think is best, and those two things are probably going to be different, right? If we're both acting freely. But Kant would say, no, in that situation we would both be reacting and hence not acting freely. If you want to act freely, you need to stop, take the rule of the universalizability, take the rule of the categorical imperative, apply it to the situation, figure out what duty requires, then do that. So if we're both acting freely under Kant, what are we going to do?
Right.
The same thing, the right thing, but it won't be something different, which is interesting.
If you think of free will, just you being able to do as you see fit, and the second that you try to say you have to apply some kind of parameter to what you do, kind of makes you like think that, well, that's not free will. I mean, I understand, I guess, what...
But if you think about it, his point is, look, when I'm in a situation where I'm acting reflexively, or I'm acting out of habit, or I behave exactly the way that my parents behaved, for example, am I acting freely? No. So to act freely for Kant is very narrow. It may turn out that none of us act freely, but we should at least try. And in order to try and maybe be successful, we have to apply the categorical imperative. That's his point. Now notice here that when he's talking about universalizability, he's assuming that there are universal objective moral truths, right? If I apply the categorical imperative and you apply the categorical imperative, we are supposed to get the exact same results, right? So when we talk about willing to be with Chris Humphreys and willing not to be with Chris Humphreys at the same time, we say, oh, that's logically inconsistent, hence it's irrational. But there may be cultures and people who don't think that logically inconsistent principles are to be rejected as irrational. For example, some Eastern thought holds that be and not be can occur simultaneously. And that's important because some people have argued, look, Kant, you claim to have a universal moral truth, but are you really giving us a universal moral truth, or are you giving us a smaller truth that is coming out of your cultural context and then trying to make it seem as though it were a universal moral truth? And I think that's a legitimate question to be asking. Okay, I apologize. I had meant to look up an article before coming, and I'm trying to Google it, and Google is asking me if I'm a robot over and over. No, I'm not a robot. Or at least I don't believe myself to be a robot at this time.
Weird that robots asking you.
Okay, so there is a school in Britain. It's the School of Oriental and African Studies, or SOAS. And this university is asking, it's a prestigious London university, and they have been having an argument basically saying, look, we are an Oriental and African Studies university, right, or college, and they want to be able to, if they're required to read Western philosophers, white philosophers, they want to be able to read them from an anti-imperialist perspective. And specifically, they're saying that white thinkers should only be studied if required, and that instead the focus should be on African and Asian philosophers. And so what happened was that there was somebody who said, there's no proof, there's no scholarship saying that Kant's theories are racist. And Dr. Kahind Andrews of Birmingham City University basically came back and defended the student's position, in part saying that, look, this idea that you can have more universal moral truths has sometimes been used to imply that people who do not see these truths as being universal moral truths are inferior, right? I mean, when you think about the logic of imperialism, there's sort of this idea of this is what objective moral truth requires, and if you don't see it, that's because there's something wrong with you. So this whole notion of universalizability may turn out to be incredibly philosophically problematic, okay? And we don't necessarily have a huge long amount of time to get into this. But when we talk about something being universal or universalizable, there is definitely this idea with Kant that there is one rationality, right? And that we all come to the same conclusions. And we could certainly ask the question, well, are they really the same conclusions if we go all over the world? Okay. But let's go ahead and move on to the second formulation of the categorical imperative, which is the formulation end in self. Act always such that the person you are treating is an end unto herself and never a means only. So in order to understand the second formulation of the categorical imperative, we need to have some understanding of the difference between what it means to be a means and what it means to be a means only. Are you and I a means to each other?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you're a means to my paycheck, right? If nobody registered for courses, I'd be out of job. And I'm a means to you getting your degree, right? If I didn't come in to teach, you wouldn't have a grade on your transcript. So we're means to each other. Does that mean that we are means only? Not necessarily. But Kant's point here is that we have to treat each other as people. I have to always remember that you are a person who is an end unto yourself. Okay? So, for example, if you show up during office hours and you've obviously been crying and you're having a really hard time, and it's 3 minutes before the end of office hours, and I change the clock so that I say office hours are over, and I leave, am I treating you as an end unto yourself? No, I'm treating you as only a means to my paycheck, right? If on the other hand, I say, look, please come in, I only have 3 minutes, but if you would, you obviously seem distraught, why don't we walk to the counselor's office and talk at the same time? And if the 3 minutes that I can give you are not enough, then perhaps they can help you. That would be a situation where I would be treating you, I mean, you're still a means, but you're also an end onto yourself. So Kant's point is that you cannot be treated as a means only. So let me turn this back over to you and ask, is there anybody here who works as a cashier? Anywhere, especially at a grocery store?
I don't want to add.
Okay, what's that like?
It depends on the person, usually. To be honest, I mean, sometimes it's enjoyable, other times it can grind on you, just because some people suck.
Okay,
Yeah.
what are some bad cashiering experiences you've had?
People throw yogurt at you.
People throw yogurt at you?
I've had people, like grown adults throw yogurt at you because they don't like the way you discount. Because I work at Froyo's in Cedar Park, so they have this little punch card that says, oh, if you fill it up, you get up to 8 ounces free. Of course, that little thing is little at the bottom of the card, so if you're really old, you probably can't read it. But we explain it to you every time you fill it up. So when you come in, they're like, oh, so it's free, up to 8 ounces. And they're like, no, but it says free, up to 8 ounces. And I've had someone throw yogurt at me over it. It's fun.
Okay, so when you have yogurt thrown at you because you're just trying to do your job and, you're only allowed to give them 8 ounces of free yogurt and they have 10 ounces and so you need to charge them for the remaining 2, do you feel like you're being treated as a person? Do you feel like you're being treated as an end onto yourself? What does that feel like?
It doesn't feel very good. It makes me want to kind of chop them in the throat, to be honest. But
Okay.
I can't because there's kids around, and I lose my job.
Also because the other person is an end onto themselves and killing them would be treating them as a means only,
Yeah, totally.
right?
Yeah.
There's that. So the idea is that is a situation where you're not being treated as an end onto yourself, right? You're merely being treated as a means to venting the frustration that this person now has to pay however much 2 ounces of yogurt is, which I can't imagine is that much money.
It's like $2, I think. $2-3 for tax. It's not a lot. People freak out about it.
But I'm supposed to have it free.
People like free.
I just tell them, like,
People just
business
expend
cards
money.
over there for the owners. If you have an issue, you can talk to them. Most of the time, people don't even bother.
I've been cussed out over a light bulb that cost $1.95.
So, what Kant would say here is that, look, you are not a light bulb dispenser.
Yeah.
You are not a vending machine of yogurt. You are a person. You have dreams, aspirations, desires. You believe yourself to have free will. You have autonomy. And when I'm interacting with you, I have to always remember that you are a person. And I can't treat you merely as a means to venting my frustration or getting my free yogurt or whatever it is. And what I think is really fascinating about teaching this is that not once have I taught this class and said, hey, has anybody worked as a cashier? And somebody raised their hand and just said, oh, I've had really positive experiences working as a cashier. Nothing bad's ever happened to me. So what does it say about how we behave towards each other? That every single person, I mean, the number of people who've told me that they've either been cussed out, had stuff thrown at them, right? Last class, it was a student who had a sandwich thrown at her. First, the customer said that there wasn't enough mayo. Then the customer said that there was too much mayo when they made the second sandwich. And each time just kept throwing the sandwich at the student.
Why do people do that?
Well, Kant would say because they're not treating each other as ends unto themselves. They're treating each other merely as means. And that's not acceptable in accordance with the categorical imperative.
Who's Christina Lopez?
Pardon?
Who's Christina Lopez?
Oh, so the cashier example that says Christina Lopez. Christina used to work here at ACC. We now have tropical smoothies, right? And Jane, who's a former student, and Delilah work there, along with a couple of other people. But before we had Simon's Cafe in the cafeteria. And Christina Lopez worked at Simon's Cafe. And Christina was an absolutely delightful person. And anytime that I was having a bad day, I would go and get a soda or a slice of pound cake or whatever. But looking back on it, it was really just to say hi to her because she was one of those people who would ask you how you were doing and more importantly, genuinely meant it, right? And I never felt like I was just somebody who was buying something from her. I really felt like I was being treated as an end onto myself when I talked to her. And unfortunately, she was hit by a drunk driver and passed away, left behind 2 kids, and never got to fulfill her dream of being a student at ACC. She had started working at Simon's in the hopes of someday being able to become a social worker here. And unfortunately, that never happened. And you might argue that driving drunk is one way of not treating people as ends onto themselves, but treating them merely as a means to your good time. So I just like to honor her memory by including her in the Kant lecture. It's at least a way for her to be in the class now. As I hinted at earlier, the third formulation of the categorical imperative is autonomy. And one way that we could talk about that is to imagine each moral agent, each person, as being the captain of her own ship. So that each person is at the helm, right? Of her dreams, her aspirations, her desires. So the idea is that, let's say that someone asks me to do them a favor. Okay? Well, I'll go with an actual situation that happened to me, right? I got a phone call from someone who said, look, I've been staying at this place and there are bed bugs and I'm getting bitten up. Can you please go to the store and get me some shampoo and a couple of other necessary things so that I can get rid of these bed bugs and leave without taking them with me. I promise I'll pay you back. Can you just run and get these things? Okay? So I ran, I made the delivery, and then it turned out that he didn't have the money. Now, is that a situation where I'm being treated as the captain of my own ship?
Yes, because you chose to do it, knowing that that was a possibility.
I mean, I suppose being that I teach philosophy, I knew to be skeptical and that there was the possibility that this person was not going to pay me back. But getting back to Brandon's question about trust earlier, right? I presume that when this person said, hey, I'm in a bind, can you go and run and get me this stuff? And, oh, I'm not going to give you the money now because I don't want to touch you and get you the bed bugs, but I'll get it to you as soon as possible. Or I'll get it to you the next time I see you. And then, oh, by the way, no, I don't have the money. Did I make an autonomous decision? A couple of you are shaking your heads. What's wrong with that situation?
Because you were told something and you forget what you were told.
I was told something, but it wasn't just that the thing that I was told was a falsehood. It was a manipulative falsehood, right? Because think about it. That same person might have called me and said, look, I just spent my last dime to get a night at this motel, and it turns out that there are bed bugs here, and I'm really in a bind. Will you help me? And I might have still gone to the store and gotten them everything that they needed and brought it to them. Or I might not have. But at least I would have had the choice to decide exactly what it was that I wanted to do in that situation. Instead, when you lie to me and say, hey, can you bring me these things? I promise I'm going to pay you back immediately. And then it turns out that no, as a matter of fact, you don't have the money. You are no longer treating me as the captain of my own ship. Because you're telling me that there's a boulder in the ship here when the boulder is really here. Right? So I might have chosen not to do it. I might have chosen to do it out of the kindness of my heart. But I still made that choice, or what I thought was that choice, under a false set of pretenses. So you're not treating me as the captain of my own ship.
That falls under also like them just using it as a means.
Right. And I'm glad you said that, because according to Kant, each formulation is supposed to be mutually replaceable with the others. Right? Remember, it's one principle, but there are multiple ways of talking about it. So another way to say that is to say, look, when you tell me that you're going to pay me back, even though you know that you don't have the money to pay me back in this moment, you're using me as a means only, right? It would have been a different situation if he had said, I intend to pay you back, but just so you know, I don't have the money right now. But let's say for the sake of argument that that had been my last however many dollars, and I was expecting this person to pay me back right away, and now I don't have money for the rest of the month to buy groceries, for example. That's a situation where I might have said, look, I'm sorry, ask somebody else.
And it's also something that you wouldn't want for the whole world as universal.
Exactly. Could I will that everybody say that I'm going to pay you back when I know that I can't, or I have no intention of doing so? Well, no, that's a false promise. Or I don't know. I mean, maybe he intended to pay me back at some point. As a matter of fact, I have not yet received the money, but that's okay, because once again, it gets to be a part of the lesson. So it's its own kind of tuition, right? Pardon?
And he has bed bugs.
Not anymore, because, that part of the problem was at least dealt with. But there's something to be said for, if you're going to treat me as a person who is autonomous, you need to give me all of the information so that I can make an informed decision, right? To a certain extent, that's what we were talking about in terms of consent, right? So when we talk about the situation where somebody, for example, has a significant other but tells you nothing about it, and you hook up with this person, are they treating you autonomously? No, because that's a piece of information that might have changed your mind, right? That's why enthusiastic consent is missing. So if we're trying to figure out what it is that consent captures, one way to talk about it is that it captures respecting a person's autonomy. I mean, obviously Kant was not around during the enthusiastic consent movement, but I imagine that he would be an enthusiastic supporter of it because he would look at it as being something that reinforces, respects autonomy. But yes, each formulation is supposed to be mutually replaceable with any other formulation. So according to Kant, it's not going to be possible for an action to violate one formulation of the categorical imperative, but somehow meet the requirements of the other two, right? So getting back to this variation on the false promise, please buy me this thing and I'll pay you back immediately, but you know that you don't have the money. Well, you can't make that a universal law, right? Because I can't will to repay you money that I don't have. That's logically inconsistent. I'm not treating you as an end unto yourself when I get you to do something under false pretenses. So that violates the second formulation. And I'm not respecting your autonomy when I get you to do something for me under pretenses that I know to be inaccurate, right? Because that's a situation where you're being manipulated. Okay, well, so far we've been talking about it in terms of moral agents or persons, and we've kind of dipped that we're mostly talking about people, right? Humans. So what is it precisely that Kant means by a person? What Kant means by a person is a rational creature. Because for Kant, the most important thing about a person is their ability to reason, right? To be rational. Well, what precisely does Kant mean by reason? There are three types of reason, according to Kant. The first is pure reason, which is your ability, for our purposes, to reason in terms of abstract mathematics. Then we have instrumental reasoning. This is the reason that you use in order to achieve some other goal, as an instrument, if you will. So if you're working as part of the Army Corps of Engineers and you have a squadron and the squadron needs to ford a river and you're trying to figure out how that river is going to be forded, this is the reason that you would use as an instrument in order to answer that question. How are we going to ford this river? Now, the part that's a little confusing about this is that seems practical. But what Kant means by practical reason is your ability to reason morally. So let's take Hitler. What are his pure reasoning skills like?
What was pure again? Sorry.
Pure reason is your ability to reason mathematically.
Basically to eliminate anyone who's not alive.
I mean, look, if we were going to answer this question, whom might we ask? I don't know, Hitler's math teacher in high school, right? So if it turns out that we dig up his records and he got really good grades in math, then we would say, okay, his pure reasoning skills were good. What about his instrumental reasoning skills?
Obviously, they were pretty good. People to do stuff that he wanted them to do.
I mean, there's something to be said for when you're, taking the gold out of the fillings in people's teeth and reusing their hair in order to make clothing, right? And when you're talking about the efficiency of the gas chambers, his instrumental reasoning skills appear to have been quite high. What about his practical reason?
I'd say it was lacking.
Yeah, you might say it was completely and utterly missing, right? Because he had a complete inability to see several classes of people as as people, right? I mean, he treated, give or take, 6 million people as a means only and not as ends onto themselves. The Shoah is not universalizable. It wasn't respecting of people's autonomy, right? So getting back to this idea of Kant, he's going to say, okay, well, a person is a rational creature, right? It is a creature who is capable of engaging in this reason. Now, Kant seems to think that human beings are the only rational creatures that exist. But we might argue that there are other creatures that exhibit rationality. Other primates, for example. Aliens, possibly. So if we had a situation where an alien landed from outer space, right? Okay, the fact that they're able to drive a starship and get here probably means that they have at least instrumental reasoning. And my guess that there was a lot of math involved in getting here, right? So that's probably pure reason. And assuming that they don't just start killing everybody on sight, they probably have some amount of instrumental reasoning, right? So if that were the case, then the categorical imperative would also apply to them, right? We have to treat them as rational creatures. Okay, well, what about an individual human being who lacks rationality? Does that mean we can just kill them? This was in your reading, but Kant argues that as long as you belong to the class human, you are treated as a rational creature, regardless of the fact of whether you actually possess rationality. Okay? So if an evil philosopher comes in and performs a lobotomy on me and leaves me unable to reason, the categorical imperative still applies to me because as a human being, I am a member of a class that is rational. So I am treated as rational regardless of whether I actually in that moment have the capacity to be rational. So you can't kill me just because somebody has lobotomized me. You still have to treat me as an end unto myself and never as a means only. You still have to respect my autonomy. And the way that I'm treated still has to be universalizable.
So for humans, he says that everybody is reasonable as long as you are a human. But in this case, to try to put this for like, I guess, creatures, is it like if you have one of those, you are qualified, or is it like you have to hit all three of these?
I mean, it's kind of interesting because Kant basically thinks that humans are the only creatures that are rational, and he doesn't really ask the question, what about dolphins? What about chimpanzees? What about aliens? It's the 1700s, so that he's not asking, what about aliens? I'm going to give him a pass on. But in terms of other animals, like if you were to ask Kant, hey, I really want to kick a puppy, is that okay? What he's going to say is, well, the puppy's not rational. So the categorical imperative doesn't apply to the puppy. Okay, for Kant, that would be like asking, I want to kick this chair. Can I kick this chair? So what he's going to say is, well, as a prudential matter, right, in terms of being careful, it might be better if you didn't kick this puppy because getting in the habit of kicking puppies might escalate to the habit of kicking humans. But then again, it might not. No, not at all. Right? I mean, the categorical imperative requires you to behave in certain ways. It's just that he doesn't think that the categorical imperative applies to non-rational creatures. So because it doesn't apply to dogs, I don't have a perfect duty not to kick dogs.
So, you say that his rational thinking isn't always moral?
It's not okay, I think that it's important to understand when you're talking about Kant is that we have actions that are morally praiseworthy. And then we have actions that are immoral. But then we have actions that lack morality, right? Like, does it make sense to talk about the morality of tying my shoes? No. Right? I mean, I tie my shoes, but you wouldn't go up to somebody and say, you did a really moral job of tying your shoes. Right? Like, that just doesn't make sense. So it's possible for actions to be morally neutral, to have no moral value. So it's not that it would be morally praiseworthy to kick a puppy, it just wouldn't be forbidden either. But that's not a maybe. Okay. Thank you so much.